The Indiana Fever front office just exposed themselves on camera, and Caitlin Clark fans are not letting this slide. What you're about to hear is not speculation. It's not fan paranoia. It's a head coach who refuses to defend her own star player, a general manager caught in a social media pattern she can't explain away, and members of the United States Congress publicly demanding answers. By the end of this video, you'll understand exactly why so many people believe the Indiana Fever organization has a Caitlin Clark problem, and why the silence from the top of that franchise might be louder than anything they could have said. Welcome back to WNBA Analysis. If you're new here, this is the channel that breaks down what's really happening behind the headlines in women's basketball, the storylines the mainstream coverage won't touch. Let's get into it. Watch this exchange closely because the reaction on the coach's face tells you everything. See, she don't want to answer. She's refusing to protect Caitlin Clark. You got up there and had plenty to say when it came to defending Aliyah Thomas. You had a whole speech ready for her. But the moment it's about Caitlin Clark, suddenly there's nothing to say. Nothing at all. That's not just a deflection. That's a head coach who has clearly been told either by the organization or by her own instincts not to touch this topic. Stephanie White had no shortage of things to say when Aliyah Thomas needed defending earlier this season. She went on passionate, detailed tangents about inclusiveness, about protecting players, about standing up for her team. But when the United States Congress sends an official letter raising concerns about potential civil rights violations against her own rookie sensation, White suddenly finds religion in staying neutral. Keeping the main thing, she calls it. Fans have noticed the contrast, and it is not subtle. Then there's Amber Cox, the Fever's general manager. Here's what she posted on X after a win over the Phoenix Mercury. A warm, glowing thank you to Fever fans for their support at home and on the road. Standard post-win PR. Nothing wrong with that on its own. But a fan account responded, pointing something out, and instead of ignoring a random reply the way any professional executive would, Amber Cox engaged directly. Let that sink in. The general manager of a professional basketball franchise, going back and forth with a Caitlin Clark fan account over social media. Now you might think that shows she cares about setting the record straight. But look closer at what's actually happening. Fans have been tracking Cox's social media behavior all season, and there is a pattern. When the Fever win without Clark on the floor, Cox is loud, celebratory, fully engaged online. When the Fever win because of Clark's playmaking, the enthusiasm noticeably drops. A fan pointed that pattern out publicly, and instead of letting it go, Cox got defensive. Now here's where it gets serious. This isn't just internet chatter anymore, it's Congress. Women's sports. We're trying to get more young women, more talented women into professional sports. Young women in my district dream of one day playing in the WNBA, and we want that to be a safe place for them to compete, no matter their race, no matter anything except their ability to play. And with Caitlin Clark, it's become increasingly clear that the treatment she's receiving from some players in this league has gotten worse. There was a moment where a player put a fist to her throat while she was pinned to the court. That's Congressman Jeff Duncan, speaking on News Nation, explaining exactly why members of Congress felt the need to send a formal letter to WNBA Commissioner Cathy Engelbert. I think it's unacceptable. I think a fifth grader looking at a compilation of what's happened to Caitlin Clark over the past couple of years would immediately recognize that this kind of behavior crosses a line. Read that again. A sitting member of Congress is saying a 10-year-old could watch the footage and instantly identify the problem. This isn't some fringe theory pushed by overly attached fans. This is elected officials reviewing compiled video evidence and publicly stating that something is deeply wrong. And how does the Fever organization respond? A brief, carefully worded statement. And when reporters press Stephanie White for more, she deflects back to that statement and shuts the conversation down. No outrage. No passionate defense of her player. Just deflection and a visible desire to move on as quickly as possible. Compare that to how casually the topic of All-Star voting gets discussed in the media. We have to be careful about how we look at player voting for the All-Star game. Players make up 25% of the vote, media 25%, fans 50%. Out of a pool of 180 roster players, only 85 actually voted. That's a small sample size. Some players vote for their teammates, their friends, that's just how it works. But there's also a real pool of players who take this seriously. You see Caitlin Clark ranked 11th among guards, and it's honestly insulting. It's almost absurd to think she'd even be in the conversation for 11th best guard in this league, let alone questioned for a starting spot. I agree completely. Pure foolishness. Let that number sit with you. 11th. The rookie shattering attendance records. The rookie shattering viewership numbers. The rookie who has single-handedly dragged the WNBA into mainstream sports conversation for the first time in the league's history. Ranked 11th by her own peers. Only 85 of 180 players actually voted, so yes, it's a small sample. But it's still revealing. Some of those votes went to teammates and friends out of loyalty. Understandable. But some of those votes were a message. And the message is clear. A segment of the league does not believe Caitlin Clark deserves recognition as an elite guard, regardless of what the stat sheet says. This ties directly back to what's happening inside the Fever organization. They are stuck between two competing realities. On one side, Caitlin Clark, who has brought them unprecedented national attention, sold-out arenas, a franchise valuation that has tripled, and relevance the team hasn't had in years. On the other side, a locker room culture, a league culture, and now a coaching staff that seems more concerned with preserving the existing hierarchy than fully capitalizing on what Clark brings to the table. Honestly, at this point they might as well just trade her. Get rid of Caitlin Clark. Indiana Fever, Amber Cox, Stephanie White, you clearly don't value her. You clearly want to go in a different direction. You just don't want to deal with the backlash that comes with standing up for her, and you've made it obvious which side of the line you're standing on. Amber Cox getting mad at Caitlin Clark fans for calling out how much happier she seems after wins without her, and not showing that same energy when Clark is the one carrying the team. Stephanie White getting irritated about a letter from Congress. This is all insane. They clearly don't want to deal with any of it. That reaction captures months of building frustration inside the Fever fan base. The suggestion, trade Clark, send her to LA, send her to Toronto, stop pretending the organization values her when the actions say otherwise, sounds extreme on the surface. But look at the pattern. Amber Cox getting defensive about celebrating wins without Clark. Stephanie White refusing to defend Clark with anywhere near the passion she showed defending Aliyah Thomas. A lukewarm organizational response to a congressional letter about the physical targeting of their own star player. The body language. The social media behavior. The carefully sanitized statements that say just enough to avoid a headline, but never enough to actually take a stand. Here's the impossible position the Fever are in. They cannot afford to lose Caitlin Clark, not financially. Season ticket renewals, sponsorship deals, national TV slots, merchandise sales, all of it is tied directly to her presence on the roster. But they also seem unwilling to fully commit to building the organization around her, because doing so would mean challenging the existing power structure both inside the locker room and across the league. Think about what Amber Cox's response really tells us. She insists Clark is a great teammate who celebrates every win the same way. She calls the narrative about her being happier without Clark ridiculous. But she felt the need to respond to a random fan account in the first place, and a professional executive with nothing to hide simply ignores a comment like that. The fact that she engaged tells you it hit a nerve. And when fans went back through months of her posting history, the pattern was there. Subtle but consistent. The Fever are trying to have it both ways. They want every financial benefit that comes with rostering the biggest star in women's basketball, the sold-out road arenas, the national broadcast windows, the merchandise revenue, the skyrocketing franchise value. But they don't want the scrutiny that comes attached to it. They don't want fans dissecting every social media post. They don't want analysts questioning every coaching decision. They don't want Congress asking whether their franchise player is actually being protected on the court. And they definitely don't want the backlash that comes when it looks like they're prioritizing other players' comfort over maximizing what Clark brings to this team. Compare one more time, Stephanie White's response about the congressional letter to her response earlier in the season defending Aliyah Thomas. For Thomas, White delivered a passionate, detailed defense. Talking about inclusiveness, about protecting her players, about the values she believes the league should stand for. It was heartfelt. It was specific. It left no doubt where she stood. But when a reporter asks her directly how she processes one of her own players being named in a letter from Congress to the league commissioner, she retreats immediately to the prepared statement and tries to end the conversation. Her answer essentially is that this is out of their control, they're not affiliated with any of the groups involved and they're focused on what they can control. Technically true. Emotionally empty. Yes, the Fever can't control what Congress decides to investigate. But they absolutely can control how loudly they advocate for better officiating around their star player. They can control whether they publicly call out dangerous, targeted plays. They can control the message they send about what is and isn't acceptable treatment of Caitlin Clark on an WNBA, basketball court. And right now, through their silence, their deflection, and their carefully hedged statements, the message they're sending is that they'd rather this entire story just go away. The congressional letter matters beyond just how the Fever handled the question. Congressman Duncan specifically framed this as a safety issue, a civil rights issue, potentially even a Title IX issue. Young women across the country dreaming of playing in this league, and a sitting member of Congress publicly questioning whether it's actually safe for them to do so, regardless of race or ability. He referenced a literal compilation of footage showing Clark being physically targeted, including a moment where a fist was placed at her throat while she was pinned to the floor. That is not a controversy that quietly disappears behind one brief team statement and a coach who refuses to elaborate. The WNBA as a league is in a genuinely precarious spot right now. This season brought unprecedented growth almost entirely driven by Caitlin Clark and the massive new audience she brought with her. But that growth has also exposed tensions that existed long before she arrived, tensions that simply went unnoticed when nobody outside the league was paying attention. The All-Star voting results exposed it. The physical play that consistently goes uncalled exposed it. The persistent media narrative painting Clark as overhyped exposed it. And now, congressional scrutiny is exposing the league's apparent inability, or unwillingness, to seriously address legitimate concerns about how its single biggest star is being treated on the court. For the Fever specifically, this has become an organizational crisis hiding in plain sight. Amber Cox and Stephanie White are both relatively new to their roles. Cox became general manager in October 2023, White was hired as head coach in November 2024. They inherited a franchise that had struggled for years, and then, almost overnight, landed the #1 overall pick and selected a generational talent in Caitlin Clark. By any normal logic, they should be celebrating that stroke of fortune every single day. Instead, based on their public behavior, they seem almost resentful of the attention and scrutiny that inevitably comes with it. The idea of trading Clark, extreme as it sounds, actually makes a certain twisted sense if you look at it from this angle. If the organization genuinely doesn't want the media spotlight, the fan scrutiny, the congressional letters, the constant public dissection of every decision, trading Clark solves all of that instantly. They go back to being a quiet, small-market franchise nobody outside Indiana pays attention to. They build around Kelsey Mitchell and Aliyah Boston without anyone questioning whether they're maximizing their talent. Amber Cox posts on social media without a fanbase of millions cross-referencing her enthusiasm levels win by win. Of course, that's not remotely viable from a business standpoint. Trading Caitlin Clark would gut the franchise's value overnight. Season ticket holders would demand refunds in bulk. Sponsors would walk. National television scheduling would evaporate. The financial fallout would be catastrophic and immediate. But the mere fact that fans are seriously floating this idea shows just how dysfunctional the relationship between this organization and its own franchise player has become. What makes this so frustrating for Fever fans is that this should be an absolute golden era for the franchise. They have a rookie who is already one of the best players in the entire league, who fills arenas in every city she visits, who has brought more national attention to this team than the past decade combined. Every decision the front office makes should be built around maximizing her talent and her marketability. Instead, the organization keeps behaving like she's a liability to be carefully managed rather than the single greatest asset in franchise history. That disconnect between what should be happening and what is actually happening is exactly what's fueling the anger you heard at the top of this video. Here's the most likely truth of it. The Fever organization probably doesn't dislike Caitlin Clark. But it's becoming harder and harder to ignore that they seem to resent everything that comes attached to her, the attention, the scrutiny, the sky-high expectations, the passionate fanbase that holds every single decision accountable. They'd probably prefer to operate the way they always did, quietly, without millions of eyes on their every move. But that ship has sailed. When you have the single biggest star in women's basketball wearing your jersey, everything you do gets examined. And if your response to that scrutiny is defensiveness and deflection instead of transparency and confidence, you are going to keep facing exactly the kind of backlash we're watching play out right now. So where does this actually go from here? The congressional letter isn't disappearing quietly. Commissioner Cathy Engelbert is going to have to respond with something more substantial than platitudes about player safety. The Fever front office is going to have to decide, once and for all, whether they're fully committed to building this franchise around Caitlin Clark, or whether they're going to keep trying to balance competing internal interests indefinitely. Amber Cox is going to have to decide whether engaging with critics on social media is worth the ongoing headache. And Stephanie White is going to have to decide whether she can effectively coach her franchise player while also managing everything else happening around her. The most likely outcome, at least in the short term, is an uneasy status quo. The Fever keep Clark because trading her would be financial suicide. They keep navigating the tension between maximizing her impact and preserving harmony within the locker room and the wider league culture. Cox and White keep deflecting the questions they don't want to answer, while trying to manage an increasingly frustrated and increasingly vocal fanbase. And fans keep scrutinizing every post, every statement, every coaching decision, looking for proof of whether this organization actually values the player who saved their franchise. But that status quo is not sustainable long-term. At some point, something has to give. Either the Fever organization fully commits to building around Caitlin Clark and accepts everything that comes with that decision, or the tension becomes so toxic that a split becomes inevitable, no matter the financial consequences. Right now, we're watching that tension unfold in real time, through defensive social media replies, through deflective press conference answers, and through a formal letter from the United States Congress asking why the biggest star in the sport isn't being adequately protected. The real question isn't whether Amber Cox and Stephanie White care about Caitlin Clark's success. In their own way, they probably do. The real question is whether they're willing to fight for her the way they fought for other players. Whether they're willing to embrace the scrutiny that comes with having a true superstar on the roster. And whether they can build a culture that celebrates what Clark brings to this franchise, instead of treating her like a complication that needs to be quietly managed. Based on everything we've seen so far, that answer remains unclear. And until it becomes clear, this tension is only going to keep festering, creating exactly the kind of dysfunction that has fans seriously wondering whether Caitlin Clark, and this entire organization, might be better off going their separate ways. Look, if you made it this far, you clearly care about this story as much as we do. This channel exists because Caitlin Clark fans deserve real, honest breakdowns, not sugar-coated headlines that protect front offices instead of players. Every single subscriber helps us keep digging into stories like this one, the ones the mainstream outlets won't touch. So if this video meant something to you, if it made you angry, if it made you feel seen, do one simple thing before you go. Hit subscribe, turn on notifications, and join this community. We're building something real here, and we genuinely can't do it without you. Final line. Now it's your turn. Is the Indiana Fever organization doing right by Caitlin Clark, or is it time for a fresh start? Drop your honest thoughts in the comments below. This has been WNBA Analysis. See you in the next one.